Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. On behalf of Conversation at the Crossroads, I welcome you all to this gathering. Before we go too far down the track, as a resident of Australia, I gratefully acknowledge the traditional owners and their custodianship of the land we call Australia. I pay my respects to their ancestors and their descendants, who over thousands of years have maintained the cultural and spiritual connection to country. I recognize the invaluable contribution of all Indigenous peoples to their countries and to the world. Conversation at the Crossroads is delighted to be hosting this event. We've hosted many events, large and small, over the last 2 years, and none more important than this one. For in climate change, we all know we're dealing with an existential threat. Not the only one of several, but one which links with just about every facet of life on this planet, and this at a threshold moment we know as COP26. So, to our program for this evening. First, we shall hear from our 4 panelists. They come with different backgrounds, different forms of engagement, different experiences, different areas of expertise, but each outstanding in their contribution to the public conversation, each generously making themselves available at an extremely busy time. We've asked our guests to help us focus on 2 things. What are we to make of COP26? And secondly, where do we go from here? After we've heard from all 4, I'll pose 1 or 2 questions as a prod to conversation amongst the panelists, and then we'll field questions from you. And this is how we propose to run the Q&A session. So please pay some attention if you are interested in asking a question to the following pointers. We ask that your question be sharp, as probing and succinct, short in words as you can make it. 2, we'd like you to focus in the main on our 2 large themes for this event. We assess COP26, and secondly, where to from here. And in the questions, we would particularly welcome an international focus rather than a purely local focus, be it this country, that country, or another country. Of course, we can take a question from one relating to this or that country, but we can't take 5 or 6 questions dealing with one country. And the 4th point I'd make, and this is terribly important, the only questions we will deal with are not the ones in the chat box, but those in the Q&A box. If you have a question, place it in the Q&A box, which is, you will find at the bottom of your screen, fairly close to the middle of the screen. Alex, who is not visible, will try and bracket some related questions together. He will then pass them on to me, and I'll put those questions as a cluster to the panel for comment, and then on to the next panel till our time is more or less up. Well, it's now my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Tim Flannery, who joins us from Glasgow. Professor Tim Flannery is Chief Counselor of the Climate Council in Australia, internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer, and one of the world's most influential environmentalists. He has published over 140 scientific publications and some 30 books. Best known now for his work on climate change, Tim established the Copenhagen Climate Council in 2007, the Climate Council of Australia in 2013, and is a former director of the South Australian Museum. In 2005, he was honored as Australian Humanist of the Year in 2007 and was named Australian of the Year, and in 2007 was named Australian of the Year. So with that introduction, Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here. Apologies for my rather unusual appearance here. I'm doing the connection on my phone. We don't have sufficient Wi-Fi at the hotel I'm staying at to make it work otherwise, so forgive the informality. But look, what I would like to do this morning is just to talk about the science of climate change as it relates to COP26. So the urgency for dealing with climate change has become ever more apparent as the burden of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere have grown. And in the latest IPCC report called the Sixth Assessment Report that was released just a few months ago, the scientists warned us that there is still a very narrow window of opportunity to avoid catastrophic climate change. And by that, they mean that we have to act this decade. And I want to just explain to you a bit about why that is. So Joe mentioned I was made Australian of the Year in 2007 and have been working ever since to see climate change addressed. But the truth is that since 2007, up to the present day, humanity has released almost a third of all of the greenhouse gases that our species has ever emitted in its entire million-year history. So that's happened just in the last 14 years. It gives you a sense of the scale and rapidity at which the problem is still growing. The other important thing to understand is that the molecule of CO2 that we put into the atmosphere today, it'll last on average about a century. Half of it will still be there after a century. Some will still be there after thousands of years. But that molecule of CO2 won't reach what the scientists call its full warming potential for 20 to 30 years. So what that means is that it gradually traps more heat over that period. And the consequence of that is that even if we stopped emitting all greenhouse gases today, the warming would continue for 20 to 30 years just by virtue of, or some warming would continue, by virtue of the new greenhouse gases that we've put into the atmosphere. So I just want to reflect a little bit on what that means. We heard some wonderful music at the beginning of our seminar. We saw the Arctic ice cap. You know, I think the chances are that by the mid-2030s, we will see an ice-free summer in the Arctic. And we talk about the death of the Arctic ice cap. That's a somewhat dramatic statement, but you know, like any death, it happens, or many deaths, it happens by degrees. And you know, it may be that we see an ice-free summer and there'll be stress on polar bears and there'll be stress on walrus and so forth. But if we act quickly, that ecosystem has the potential to recover. If we don't act this decade, if we see this coming decade just like the last decade, we are really liable to trigger a series of tipping points in the climate system, which will mean that no matter what we do, the warming will continue. And this is why the scientists talk about that narrow window of opportunity to act now. I guess it's very, you know, looking at the climate system is very much looking like a health problem. You know, you can eat 2 pies a day and smoke 3 packs of cigarettes and drink, you know, 5 bottles of beer a day for some time before you start feeling ill. And you might say to the doctor, look, I'm still feeling okay, you know. The doctor will say, but what you're doing is laying down the preconditions for a catastrophic outcome. And that's what we're doing with climate change now. We're laying down the preconditions for a catastrophic outcome. And the climate change that we're seeing today, the droughts, the floods, and so forth, they're just the first notes of a great scenario, great opera that will play out as the climate worsens. And we know from the geological record that if we leave this issue unaddressed for decades, we really risk some very severe consequences of climate change, unthinkable consequences of climate change, where the Earth will develop a toxic atmosphere, the oceans will die, and life will be really under severe threat. We've seen this in the past in the geological record, so we know it's possible. Not likely, it's a small chance, but it is possible. So the question we have to ask ourselves really as we come to the COP is, how do we get all of the nations of the world acting in unison or together to develop an effective means of cutting our emissions hard and fast? I've been involved with COPs now for, oh goodness, since 2006, a long time. I remember I played a pretty key role in the Copenhagen COP15. We were really hoping that might be the moment when we could see the nations of the world act together. But in that COP, the UN was still talking about a top-down approach. And we just weren't getting any cut through with the top-down approach. We really weren't. It was very hard. And it was at the end of that COP, it looked like everything was going to fail, that President Obama produced the Copenhagen Accord, which posited a bottom-up approach, said if the nations set their own targets and we just add them all up, perhaps we'll get somewhere. So ever since 2009 at Copenhagen, that has been the approach. We saw a major breakthrough in Paris in 2015, where we finally got that agreement to act together. So if you think about it as a sporting event, you can say we had an agreement to run a horse race then, right? That's what we got in Paris. Incredibly difficult to do. The French were really pulled off a magnificent outcome there. And here we are now 5 years on. We've agreed to have a horse race, but we've got to get all the horses in the stables. We've got to get them facing in the same direction, and we've got to get them ready to go with the starter bell. And that's what this meeting is like. That's what Glasgow is about, getting everyone together with sufficient ambition to start that great race to zero, net zero emissions. When you're in a meeting like this, they are large, they're messy, it's very hard to see what's going on, often till some time after the meeting. But I can tell you a few things about this meeting that set it apart from the others. The first is that it's the first major meeting we've had where a win-win outcome is possible. Now, Christiana Figueres talks about this. She says that because clean energy is now so cheap, it's actually more cost-effective for developing nations to put clean energy infrastructure in place rather than coal. We've also seen at this meeting a number of initiatives to limit coal and limit the financing of coal that are quite promising. So those two things together, the win-win, the limiting of financing and subsidies for fossil fuels, is very promising to see that happen. The other thing about this meeting is that, of course, there are always nations that are at the back of the pack. Australia, notably one of them, but Saudi Arabia and Russia as well. This is the first meeting I can remember where there's been nowhere for those nations to hide. Normally there's been enough long grass around the meeting, enough disagreement, enough issues for them to hide. This meeting is not. Australia stands out like a sore thumb. Our booth was, many people commented on the fact that it was all about fossil fuels, and that was not a good thing. So the COP presidency rests with the UK. Boris Johnson has taken this on as a personal challenge. It's a good thing that it's a Conservative government, because it shows the Australian Conservative government just how much can be done in terms of climate change under a Conservative moral philosophy, if you want. I'm really hopeful for a good outcome at this COP. The cumulative pledges that have been made so far sit about at the most optimistic outcome, about 1.8 degrees. So if we do everything, we'll end up peaking at 1.8 degrees of warming. Some assessments are not quite as optimistic as that. They say perhaps we're still at 2.1, 2.2, somewhere there, 2.4 perhaps even. But regardless, this is the very first time we've had an indication that we're below 2 degrees in terms of our cumulative outcomes. Of course, some of the pledges that have been made are very long term. So the Indian pledge to hit net zero by 2070 it's a long way into the future. But the fact that India has made a pledge at all is really unprecedented and very important. They're on the journey now. It's simply a matter of speeding up. The same is true for Australia. We're on the journey. It's a matter of speeding up. One of the things to watch for out of this COP will be whether in the final statement we get some agreement to review our targets on an annual basis. In other words, at the end of 2022, nations like Australia will have to come together and tighten up their ambitions, increase their ambitions. If that happens, I think we'll be on a good chance and we'll have a reasonable probability of landing our agreement at least between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming. I just wrap up by saying that, these are all words, as every agreement ever made ever is. We're getting the horses ready to race now. So the proof of the pudding, of course, will be in the actions that nations take to honour those pledges. But every agreement, every political agreement is the same, whether it's an agreement to end a war or an agreement to do whatever, it's always the same thing. The fact we've got the agreement, I think, is extremely important. And you can see the pressure now being built, not just by governments, but by the financial sector, by companies, and by society to see those pledges honoured and increased. So I think this is the first COP I've been to where I have felt as optimistic as I do. Of course, we could always go off the rails. We haven't seen the final statement yet, but I think that this COP will be looked back on as a real benchmark where we all agreed on the direction of the race and its distance. We're still arguing about the distance, whether it's 2030, 2050 or 2070, but at least we've got a race together and the horses are in the stalls. So I'll leave it there. I know there's many other speakers, but that's my general overview of where we are.
Joe, unmute, please.
Very foolishly, I did not unmute. I had thanked, and now I thank again, Tim for his summation of what he sees as what needs to be done and what we may accomplish at COP 26. We'll have to see. But thank you for making time available. Now I would have normally have been moving across to Marinelle Ubaldo from the Philippines, who's also in Glasgow. She must have been waylaid for some reason. We're waiting to hear from her, but since she's not with us right now, I'll move on to our next speaker. So let me introduce Robyn Eckersley, who for a change will speak to us from Melbourne. Robyn is Professor in Political Science at the University of Melbourne and a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. She's a leading international relations scholar, has held many academic positions in universities in both the UK and Europe. Her book, The Green State, Rethinking Democracy and Sovereignty, won the Melbourne Woodward Medal in 2005, a very well-known, important contribution to the literature. She serves on many editorial advisory boards of leading international journals, and in numerous books, chapters, and articles has continued to make a major contribution to the theory of the green state, green democracy, and ecological governance more generally. So, Robyn, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Joe, for organising this. And as Joe said, I've been focusing on climate change for some time, and there's so much to say about COP26, it's hard to know where to start. So what I thought I'd do would be to focus on the two biggest emitters, the E2, the US and China, which together make up almost 40% of global emissions. And just in the last 24 hours, there's been a really important development, which is the US-China joint Glasgow Declaration. And this is not unlike a very important joint statement that China and the US made in 2014 at the Lima COP in Peru, the penultimate COP before Paris, which really did amazing work in injecting momentum into the negotiations. And they've done quite a few declarations since. So this one is an important one. It's not quite as historic and momentous, I think, as the 2014 one and subsequent ones. But it is important, and it's obviously carefully timed in the second week to try and make everyone have a final push. So I want to briefly say what's good about this, what's problematic about, and then zoom back and look at what's really at stake here in the negotiations. Because as everyone knows, the really key issues at this COP are driving up mitigation ambition, and to do that, you need to ramp up climate finance, because that will unlock mitigation potential in the global south. And because of the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities, developed countries have to go harder and earlier. And to do otherwise is effectively to kick the ladder down for developing countries who in general are much less responsible and have less capability and are more vulnerable. So it's a triple injustice. So there's a strong justice element here. But having the two major emitters get together and talk is really important. In fact, it's the only bright spot in US-China negotiations generally at the moment. So what's in the announcement? Well, I think one of the best things is they're focused on methane, you know, a much more potent global warming gas than climate change. It's more than CO2. It's much more short-lived. They've got a lot of quite detailed and concrete plans in there for cooperating on energy, on electrification, on all sorts of things. Carbon capture, usage and storage, not so good, but certainly they've mentioned the circular economy, managing intermittent renewable energy. They've set up a committee, a working group on enhancing climate action in the 2020s, which is really important because this is the critical decade. They've both agreed to communicate their 2035 NDC in 2025. They've agreed it's important to close the mitigation gap and pursue, I wish they said reach 1.5. And they're generally trying to get things moving. But I think also the US said it's going to be seeking to get 100% carbon-free electricity by 2035, although this is not new. It was in Biden's announcement in his climate summit in April. And China has also said it will start phasing out coal from 2025, which is in its 15th five-year plan. But of course, we know China was one of the obstructors at the G20 meeting just held on the eve of COP26, opposing a draft that was trying to have developed countries phase out by the end of 2030 and developing countries by 2040. And between now and 2025, they're continuing to build coal plants. So let's put all of this in a broader perspective. Firstly, the US, Biden's gone out there aiming really high. There's no doubt about it. From his first executive order in office, it's quite extraordinary. But now everyone can see that he's having a similar problem that Obama had, because of what the ructions going on in Congress. The Democrats control the House. They've only got a one-seat majority in the Senate, and Joe Manchin from West Virginia is opposing Biden's phase out of coal and gas. And so it's going to be difficult for him to prosecute this agenda other than through regulations. But we now know that the Supreme Court is stacked 6-3, Republican to Democrat, and Trump was busy appointing federal Republican judges on the federal circuit, district circuit. So in the courts, that's going to land. And so there's a real problem here, despite the fact that Biden's also promised a whopping $11.4 billion per year by 2024. So this is really important to getting that global finance goal, which was promised for 2020 of 100 billion annually for developing countries, and it's still falling short, and it doesn't look like it's going to be reached till about 2022, 2023, and that's not good. And in fact, I even thought there might even be a walkout by developing countries on this, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. So I think we also need to look at this in a larger context. Certainly, China has its own problems domestically, certainly with the sort of mini energy crisis we've got on at the moment, and it's difficult to control the provinces, just like it is for Biden. But we also need to look at China's changing emissions profile. China's emissions have tripled over the last 3 decades, tripled. And its aggregate emissions exceed those of all developed countries combined. Its per capita emissions are still lower than the US, but they're very close to the OECD average, and they're certainly bigger than the EU's. China is now the second biggest historical emitter at 11.4%. The US has got the giant Yeti footprint of 20%. So these two carbon giants really do matter. And the problem with China, while we need to understand it has unmet development need, you could say that also in the US, there's a lot of poverty, but China's is more extensive. Nonetheless, China's not changed its negotiating stance. In line with its changing per capita and historical profile, because we need to make allowances for the fact that it has a very large population. So we need to think about subsistence and luxury emissions going down in China, because there's a middle class in China consuming at the average Australian or British or US level, but there's a lot of poor people as well. So we need to bear those in mind. We also need to realize that the changing distribution of labor in the world means that there's a lot more emissions coming from factory Asia, and we're purchasing those goods in the West and not taking responsibility for the emissions. So things are complicated, but for all that, the brute fact is that if China doesn't speed up its decarbonisation this decade, 1.5 degrees is out of sight. And that's annihilation for the vulnerable forum, the V20 as it's called, although it's more than 40 countries. So this is the painful reality. So we're seeing a split within the G77, and we're seeing this in the negotiating groups at COP, particularly the like-minded group of developing countries, which issued a statement prior to the COP, which made a lot of really important points, but also China tends to hide inside that group a little bit, and it really is a different type of beast to most of the countries in that group. And then there's the Vulnerable Forum, whose manifesto was pushing for one of the ideas that Tim mentioned, which is to have an annual platform for ramping up NDCs. Five yearly is just too long, as it were. So these are the problems we're looking at, and I don't have much time to go any further. There is a draft COP decision text circulating. It's disappointing in that because it looks like the climate finance goal is not going to be met. And there's more I could say about that, but I've run out of time, so we can deal with that a little bit later. So that's my take on the E2.
Joe, unmute, please.
I'm a terror for not unmuting myself, so apologies. I was again thanking Robyn for this very quick overview of what two major powers are doing, China and the US, and looking at it both in terms of some of the more positive signs, as well as some of the more negative ones. And there is no shortage of those. Well, now we're going to, for a moment, a very short moment, have a little interlude. We're going to look at two very brief video clips which show contrasting assessments of the first week of COP26.
People all over the world are now increasingly outraged by the lack of adequate response, but also persuaded that it is urgent that we all move and move together. So the bottom line is that I personally, having been to many COPs, will tell you there is a greater sense of urgency at this COP. There's a greater sense of focus. And I have never, in the first few days of any of the COPs I've been to, counted as many initiatives and as much real money being put on the table, even as there are some question marks legitimately about some of the money. I get that.
The Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg has accused world leaders of deliberately postponing much-needed drastic action against global warming and said they were fighting instead to keep the status quo. Addressing thousands of young people at a rally in Glasgow, she called the COP26 climate summit little more than a celebration of business as usual.
On stage, Ms. Thunberg dismissed COP26 as a PR exercise.
This is no longer a climate conference. This is now a Global North Greenwash Festival. A 2-week-long celebration of business as usual and blah, blah, blah. They cannot ignore the scientific consensus, and above all, they cannot ignore us, the people, including their own children.
Well, there you are, and it's up to us to make an assessment. Where does the truth lie in between these two very contrasting views of what happened, at least in the first week? Will the second week prove better than the first? Well, now let me turn to Kavita Naidu, again who's joining us from Glasgow. Kavita Naidu is an international human rights lawyer, passionate about protecting the human rights of marginalized groups. She's been admitted to practice law in New Zealand, Fiji, and Australia. Kavita has worked for the UN Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights in Fiji, the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat also in Fiji, the New South Wales Director of Public Prosecutions in Australia, Oxfam Australia, and engaged in private legal practice in the UK. She has worked for the Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, and is a board member of Greenpeace Australia Pacific. Kavita, it's a pleasure to welcome you. Please address us.
Thank you, Joseph, and a very good morning to all of you from a very cold Glasgow. I'll bring a perspective of what this COP means for marginalized groups who I work with. I am also part of the coordinating team of the Women and Gender Constituency, which is one of the observer groups out of the 10 observer groups in COP. And it's an umbrella organization that looks at, that has members from around the world, women's rights and environment organizations. And it has been extremely challenging for civil society from the global south to even be here physically, to engage in COP processes and even be allowed the space or the access. And I'll explain this because I think this is really important. The COVID crisis has deepened inequalities in the world, and more so in the global south because of vaccine apartheid. The global north went on a frenzy and stockpiled vaccines. Africa still only has 4% of its population vaccinated. The UK did not allow many of these countries and the people in these countries access to this COP because they weren't vaccinated. So we really have to question the systems that are operating to deliberately make people vulnerable. So this is a clear example in COP of what this has happened. Usually it takes 3 months to even get visa to enter UK from some of these global south countries. They put them on the red list. And then 3 days before COP starts, they've decided that, okay, we should just remove some of them from the red list countries. This means that most of our members have not been able to make it here. Now, to compound this, it is so badly organized. We have been standing outside in queues for 90 minutes in freezing temperatures just to gain access. The over-security is also a huge worry because they shadow us, they hound us, they harass us for the work we're to do here, which is to really hold our governments accountable. I know activists are being arrested in Glasgow for the demonstrations. And so while John Kerry can stand up there and really say, they have a right to be outraged, we are persecuted for that rage. And this is a huge problem. So we really need to recognize that. In saying that we're all putting ourselves at great risk being here, this event is a super spreader. COVID cases are rising. My own team has gone into self-isolation from today because we've had a case. These are the real challenges. And this challenge is happening while we're trying to fight for climate crisis, which is an invisible crisis, but also not only as serious as COVID, but perhaps even more so, because this is all not just about humans, but it's about our marine ecosystem. It's about our plants, our ecosystems, and so forth. So this is the context of what COP has been while we've been here. And then what we've found at this COP is decreasing space for civil society. We have been able to access meetings previously where we make interventions, really reminding parties about human rights. It's not really so much about 1.5 or halving emissions or 2030 or timeframes. It's about human rights of people whose lives are being impacted every single day, that leaders spend delaying doing what they're supposed to do. There have been many highfalutin statements, pledges, and declarations. It means nothing if the people on the ground don't see anything that's helping them adapt, build resilience. And more so the topic of what Robyn has been talking about, climate finance. We really came here hoping that money was going to be pushed into not only adaptation. One must realize that many global South countries and their communities have gone past the point of adaptation and resilience. Climate change has become irreversible and permanent in many of these communities. They are being displaced by thousands and perhaps even millions. We require the finances, the resources to be able to protect the human rights of those who have been worst impacted. And that would be first and foremost the women in every community, because women in the global South are still fighting for gender equality, are still fighting against discrimination and violence, still do not have the capacity resource to be able to adapt. And it's unfair to burden women constantly as being resilient enough to, keep putting up with the injustice of the climate crisis. And so these are the discussions that we actually push forward when we talk to the leaders at this COP. Yesterday, all the constituency focal points met with Antonio Guterres and Boris Johnson. And I was there representing the women and gender constituencies. And Boris opened by sharing that, we really need to challenge the business and corporations. This is hugely problematic, and we know that, and you must stand up and challenge business and corporations. I reminded Boris that as you enter this venue, your major partners are corporations. The private sector delegations, businesses and corporations have completely overtaken COP. There are more business and corporations in this COP than anything else. Our pavilions, so Australia's pavilion was sponsored by Santos. Same with Africa, same with many countries. Corporations are sponsoring their pavilions. We've got business leaders in state delegations, as part of state delegations. They are here hijacking and sabotaging and pushing forward false solutions. Net zero is not a solution. Everyone is becoming frenzied about net zero. It means nothing. What we need is real zero. And that means what Robyn has said, immediate emissions in the next decade, not 30 years from now. In 30 years, what does that mean for the people of the global South? I cannot even begin to imagine. Another thing that's being peddled out here, nature-based solutions. No, nature-based solutions come in the form of carbon offset mechanisms, which is your RED Plus programs, which is selling of carbon credits, which basically means you buy off the remaining forests. And so you're allowed to keep emitting in your developed countries by protecting forests. And by protecting forests, they go into conservation or fortress conservation, which means you evict indigenous populations, or you still keep approving licenses for mining in other countries. And so there is something deliberately very wrong with this entire system. And that's where we as civil society are fighting hard. Nobody talks about capitalism. None of the leaders talk about capitalism. Nobody talks about militarism. Nobody talks about the trillions that are being used to fund militarism, and yet they aren't able to put a single cent on loss and damage. Yes, people are recognizing that damage is irreversible and permanent, and they feel really bad about it. But are they doing anything? No. And this is the reality of COP. We are asking for rights-based approaches. We are asking for protection of Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous rights. We are asking for gender equality. We're asking for environment integrity. That is not net zero. That is not nature-based solutions. So this is just some of the challenges that we have right now, and we're fighting hard on the text. And I won't go into the text because I think I'll lose most of the audience, because it is very convoluted. It is extremely challenging to keep on top of, you know, the hundreds of technical working groups and what they're doing. So yes, on the one hand, you see leaders saying all the right things about ending fossil fuels, not financing fossil fuels. And yet we know that UK is the largest coal and oil exporter in all of Europe. And we still have so many coal and oil that's in the pipeline. And it's the same for Australia. We've got hundreds in the pipeline. So what they say and what they do is completely contradictory. And at the end of the day, the work I do is with marginalized community, and they are suffering. They are suffering and they're struggling. And this attitude that, you know, and this is also it's a class issue as well. You know, we're coming up with solutions that are only benefiting urban middle class and elite in our cities. We are not thinking about the rural, the remote, and obviously those such as the indigenous populations, the Torres Strait Islanders, the Pacific Islanders, and all the marginalized communities of the global South, people living with disabilities, migrants, refugees. You know, these are the conversations that we're pushing for very hard for people to realize that it is outside technology. We're talking about people's lives. We are talking about the last remaining forests of this world. We're talking about oceans that are no longer able to absorb. What are we doing about things like this? And I'll stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you, Kavita, very much. It is a sobering account that you've given us of the plight of those who are most vulnerable around the world, and whose voices seem to be the ones that are often ignored. We'll come back to all this. In a few moments, we'll be able to, in a sense, come to the meat of this gathering, which is a vigorous conversation with our three guests. We are three, not four, because I hope nothing untoward happened to Marinelle Ubaldo, but she hasn't been able to join us, and hopefully she's still safe and sound somewhere in Glasgow. Before we go on to the conversation, I thought I would take everyone's attention for just a couple of minutes, if I may, because rather than do this at the end, I thought it would be more appropriate to do now. I'd like to announce what I consider to be the most important project that Conversation at the Crossroads has yet undertaken. On the 24th of November, 13 days from today, we are launching an ambitious project which goes by the name Conversations That Matter. It's a project more than a year in preparation that goes to the heart of our philosophy, if you like, to the very reason for our existence. Today, we're discussing one existential challenge, climate change, but we know there are others. Other environmental crises, chemical emissions, loss of biodiversity, to name just a few. And then, of course, we think of the COVID pandemic that has already killed millions, with more COVID variants probably to come, and in all likelihood, more pandemics in the future. On top of this, and Kavita has already referred to this, explosive social and economic inequalities within and between countries, unprecedented refugee flows, with more to come. Climate change will make sure of that. And let's not forget the nuclear sword of Damocles, still hanging over us, and as the atomic scientists are telling us, more threatening now than ever before, perhaps even at the height of the Cold War. Simply put, Conversation at the Crossroads operates on the basis of a basic proposition that we've reached a critical threshold in human history. We are literally at the crossroads. And so with so many forks in the road, The question is which way to turn, how to respond. The only available option, it seems to us, is to come together, to engage in probing, searching conversation around the challenges we face, the options before us, the obstacles, and there are many, that stand in the way of a habitable future, and how these obstacles can be overcome. It's a project that will cultivate the skills we need for informed, thoughtful, sustained, respectful conversation, in which listening is as important as speaking. Conversation in small groups with people we know and people we don't know. So the launch of the project on the 24th of November, in person for those in Melbourne, online for others. We'll put on the table in words, images, and music the vision of this project, Conversations That Matter. A project that aims to generate a global network of small conversation groups engaged in conversation around pressing challenges of our time, affecting us differently in different parts of the world. And over time, the ideas of each group, their insights, their findings, their proposals, their recommendations, shared with other groups, forming part of a larger and sustained conversation that creates a buzz and unstoppable momentum. emceed by the inimitable Tasneem Chopra, the event will see the project launched by Mitch Tambo, fittingly an Indigenous man and a musician of extraordinary talent, wisdom, and commitment to justice and reconciliation. Then we'll hear from people that have already started these small conversation groups or are about to in Victoria, New South Wales in Australia, Amsterdam, Lisbon, and elsewhere, with many opportunities for people attending to mingle, chat online and in person, with more live music, and for those present, food and drinks, and with our apologies that we haven't yet found a way to share that online. Of course, we'd love you to attend. We'd hope that you will. But my request to everyone taking part in this gathering, this webinar this evening, is different. It is simple. Can you, each and every one, as of tomorrow, personally invite others? Can you share with them the information we're about to send you? Can you ask them to join you? Whatever you do, please remember Wednesday, the 24th of November, and do what you can, do the best you can to help us make it a day to remember. Well, so much for that. Now, to the issue at hand, climate change. And I'd like to pose a question to everyone, to all our three speakers. And it is this. For years now, we've had a massive effort going on in different parts of the world on climate change. Innumerable scientific reports. Each year, each report stronger, firmer, sharper, more ominous than the year before. We've had luminaries of all kinds, scholars, intellectuals, entertainers, artists, sports people, and many others, strongly calling out for immediate drastic action. We've had thousands, tens of thousands, probably millions of people, young people marching in the streets. But the going seems to be still very tough, if we're to understand what's happening now. Am I wrong in the impression? And tell me, all three of you, what you think, that we're focusing far too much on certain structures, on governments around the world. And if you place climate change in the context of all the other problems I was mentioning a moment ago, they're not doing terribly well. In fact, they're doing pretty badly on so many different fronts. Are they really fit for purpose? Might the time be very close when we need to re-examine the adequacy of our institutions, national and international, if we are going to be equal to the task? Is this a moment for very drastic reflection of the kind I'm suggesting? What do you think? It's open to all of you, so who wants to jump in first? Don't be bashful.
I'll jump in, Joe, if you want, just to start things off.
Yes, please.
I'd like to just reflect on what Kavita was saying and what Greta Thunberg was saying in context of your question. It's very clear now that the systems that we have that for governance are simply inadequate. They are not representative. They're not effective in doing what they do. And therefore, they do need to change. And what I think we're hearing with a lot of the protests, the climate protests, are not just about climate, but about the system. People want changes in the economic and governance systems they operate under. The thing about climate change is that it is absolutely urgent. We have to focus on those reducing emissions with a laser-like intensity, because if we don't do that, the problems that Kavita was saying are already permanent in parts of the world will become permanent for the globe. The entire place will collapse, and we've got very little time to do that. So I am very empathetic with those calls for changing the system. And absolutely, and more representation for women and minorities and all the rest, it all absolutely needs to happen. It's critical. I've seen it firsthand, the problems that women face in the developing world as they face climate change. But we also have this very, very urgent issue. Perhaps we can do both things at once. The one thing I would say, that thinking about changing global systems, whether they be energy systems or governance systems, is a translatable skill. So we're talking about changing global energy systems, and that is enormously empowering for people who want to change other global systems. So I think the climate, the kind of climate response is doing more than just dealing with climate potentially. Over time, perhaps we will see changes to these other systems as it's become ever more self-evident that they're not fit for purpose.
Yes, who would like to go next?
I'll jump in if I may.
Of course.
One of the questions I set my students to ponder in a subject called global environmental politics is what I call the global environmental governance paradox. That is, for 30 to 50 years, we've been building more and more treaties, more and more laws, more and more policies to address the global ecological crisis, of which climate change is exhibit A and biodiversity loss is exhibit B. But these two irreversible problems are getting worse. So that's the challenge. That's the paradox. Why is it, with all this effort, all this science, everything, it's getting worse? Well, there's lots of exciting essay responses I get, but I'll just share my own analysis. And that is, the two main social steering systems of this globe are states and capitalist markets. And they are mutually reinforcing and mutually dependent. And as the late Ulrich Beck said, they're systems of organized irresponsibility. That's why we have a climate emergency movement, to mobilize citizens, but to pressure. But the thing about the climate emergency movement, it understands that we need to change the rules. And it understands that only states have the wherewithal to discipline capitalist markets to the degree required to rein in emissions, because they'll never do it by themselves. And turning our back on the states is not the solution either. So nothing will happen without mobilization from below, nothing. And constant pressure. And the tide is turning. It's just, will it be fast enough? That's the crucial question. And so what you actually need is, we have this problem of combined but uneven development, which includes unequal environmental load displacement. And it's a deep structural injustice on both economic, social, and ecological grounds. So there's no way of dealing with this. There's no way of getting developing countries on board unless we have a global just transition. And so that's why the climate finance is so important. And one little spark on the hill is this big effort now from Britain, France, Germany, and others to kick in like $5.8 billion to help South Africa accelerate its decarbonisation. There are more than 90,000 people in South Africa that work in coal mines. We have to look after them. right? We have to look after them. So this is a means of doing all that's needed to build other industries, to find something new for the workers, and to understand that the most vulnerable should not be left behind in this process. And the ILO now has principles on just transition. Spain has a ministry for ecological transition. So does France. Germany just had a coal commission, but it should be much broader. So this is a justice problem more than anything else. And capitalism is not designed to deliver justice. So the people have to make states to discipline capitalism to make sure it is. And that's the only way I can see a solution to this problem and to the paradox I mentioned.
Kavita, any thoughts?
It's a big question, Joe, but I agree with both Tim and Robyn. I'll put another perspective to this. I think, you know, we really have to recognize what that global South and global North divide is. And the global North owes the global South a historical debt and a climate debt. The historical debt is coming because through colonialism, imperialism, through exploitation and plunder of global South peoples to build your economies in the global North. We are deliberately poor and vulnerable because of the genocide, the plunder, the exploitation. And we've been kept there for a very long time through colonialism. And that colonialism still works through capitalism. It's a system that's propped by our international trade and investment, which continues to bind the global South in unjust contracts of exploitation, plunder, and cheap labor. And that burden falls entirely on the unpaid care work of women in the global South. That value has been put at 11 trillion by Oxfam recently. So this is why not only aid that is coming from the global North to the global South is critical in building the social infrastructure that we need for education, health, employment, and just employment, and all of this. You know, that's one. And then there is a climate debt. And the climate debt is also that the Industrial Revolution only benefited the global North. They have been able to progress so far in terms of technology, infrastructure, and so forth, because they have been burning fossil fuels for a very long time to get here. And now the developing South, like China and all of these countries, are equally as culpable because they decided that development through dependence on a fossil fuel economy was also the way to go. So they basically replicated what was already happening in their own countries, thus exacerbating inequalities, pollution, waste, environment degradation, and so forth. And yet here they come to these spaces and saying, well, we're developing, we're allowed to develop, and we're going to develop exactly in the same way that the global North did, because we don't know anything different. But in recent times, there is now a recognition that, okay, climate change is impacting everybody. And so we all need to take a global stand on how we're going to address this challenge. And you're right, at the end of the day, states are the only institutions we have right now that we're pushing hard to make the changes that we need. And I do a bit of work around the Global Green New Deal. And so far that's coming across as a package that may provide a solution. However, we critique the Global Green New Deal because that Global Green New Deal needs to be decolonial and it needs to be feminist. It cannot push forward just transition or renewable energy as solutions if those solutions are again only benefiting the global North. And right now, Tesla cars being the solution only benefits those who can afford it. Tesla cars is not the solution. Locally led and community owned energy grid systems that are spreading across the global South and in many parts of the global North, that is a viable, just solution. So, and it's the same thing when it comes to not just, but just an equitable transition. Just an equitable transition for mine workers in Germany should also apply to just an equitable transition for vulnerable communities, vulnerable populations in different parts of the world. What are their alternatives if they're being, if all they know is that they're working in mines? And unlike Germany, where, you know, your workers would have all the labor rights and protections, We don't have that in Bougainville. We don't have that in rural Australia. You know, these are people that are being exploited. So we really need to strengthen how we move into a clean and just world based on, you know, regenerative care economy, and that's sustainable. And we have to do that hand in hand with recognizing that the human rights, so it's a rights-based approach that would be the answer in terms of really shifting the systems of power and change. And fundamentally, the states are responsible. And there is another layer that we must start challenging, and we're not doing enough, and they're so far ahead in this game, and that is the power of the tech industries. So states are not only being propped by private corporations and military in many parts of the world, but tech industries are also pushing an agenda that's entirely based on profit and power. And that's further undermining all the work that has been done on progressing human rights. And you can see Twitter was able to shut down activists in India.
Kavita, may need to...
oh, sorry. Yes, of course, I'll stop there.
It's just that Tim is going to leave us in the matter of a few minutes, and I was keen to put a few questions to all three of you, but having in mind Tim in particular, since he's going to be leaving us fairly soon. So let me put two or three questions together, and we have quite a lot of questions. As renewables, question one, as renewables are put three together, as renewables become economically viable, what is it that's stopping governments and companies from fully embracing that road, the road of renewables? What is it that's preventing real drastic and quick and immediate progress? What is the scale of the financial support that needs to be given to the developing world, the global south, if the whole question of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and support is to really make headway? And are we getting anywhere near that point as of now? And is there any prospect that the United States will achieve carbon-free electricity within the next few years, and eventually get the bulk of its electricity free of fossil fuels? So, Tim, would you like to have a go at any or all of those questions before you go?
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. I will. I'll just talk about what's holding us back. And, you know, the best way to try to understand that is to look at a single country. And Australia is a good example. So why aren't we shutting down our few remaining coal-fired power plants and moving straight to renewables? All of the modelling that's been done suggests we could do it within 5 years and have clean electricity. So what's holding us back is, first of all, a political problem. The coal-fired power plants are very concentrated in regional electorates, and we need to, governments need to bring together a just transition, the sort of thing Kavita was talking about, for those communities. And so far, governments have been unwilling or unable to do that. Secondly, and these compound each other, these problems, the industries themselves want to keep on making money. So they influence government policy. The coal industry for years has written energy policy in this country through lobbyists that come into government. And, ministers will leave the energy portfolio and then join a board of an energy company or a lobby group for an energy company. So there is what I would call corruption there, too much influence by the fossil fuel industries. But despite those factors, things are changing. And of course, those industries want their assets to pay off. So if we look at the gas industry, they've put $100 billion into gas in Australia. That's a very large bet. It's looking like a very bad bet, but they want government to do everything it possibly can to make sure those fossil fuels keep flowing so they don't lose their money. So there's three things there. But my guess is they're not going to be able to hold out forever. If you look, for example, at New South Wales, where a Liberal government has brought in legislation that will effectively end the burning of coal by 2030. You see where things are going, and communities, one after the other, are looking at microgrids and the way that they might manage themselves. Industries are doing the same. Everything from mining companies that are moving away from diesel to moving to solar with battery backup, through to dairy farms that are using methane from cattle waste to do a lot of their electricity generation. Things are changing very rapidly. So just to go to your second question, I think that the US could easily, within the next decade, get rid of all of the coal out of its grid and move to a very clean energy production. The thing about the electricity grid is we're dealing with relatively few plants. There's probably globally, in the low thousands of individual plants to shut down. It's very different from replacing every motor vehicle in the world where there's, 90 million new vehicles being made a year. So the electricity bit is in some ways the easy bit. And if the politics and the special interests that get out of the way, we could do it very quickly. Thanks, Joe. I do have to go now, so apologies, but what a wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you for being part of it, and good luck with your remaining activities in Glasgow.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.
Now, Robyn and Kavita, do you want to add anything in answer to those questions that some of which Tim has already handled?
I'll just quickly address the one about the US. Coal is on the way out in the US because of the fracking revolution, which made gas so cheap. Coal-fired plants were no longer economic. But unfortunately, the US's rising emissions are coming from methane now, from gas and fracking, and that has to be closed down. And so that's part of Biden's plan. But as I foreshadowed in my discussion of the ructions in Congress, it's worse than I've suggested, because when we get to the midterm congressional elections, which is next November, next year, it's quite likely the Democrats will lose their one-person majority in the Senate, and who knows what's going to happen in the House of Representatives. So that's going to be a real problem because of the extreme polarization in the US. And also there's such a big difference between red and blue states on this area. We've got California, an economy bigger than most states, powering ahead, but many others aren't. And because the Senate representation is based on states, a bit like Australia, where you might have a little state like Wyoming with a small population with the same number of senators as California, it's not a very representative system, but on the other hand, it does give those poor regional communities representation. So the one thing the Democrats should do is not do what Hillary did, is call the people in those regions the deplorables. I think what they need to do is recognize that they need an economic future and to start anticipating that and working on it ASAP, or they'll lose the vote. And that's so all of that is to say, I'm not confident that that particular goal will be met, certainly in terms of the politics of the next few years, but after that, things could change.
Kavita, anything you want to add?
I think ultimately, this is a problem that each one of us have recognized. We've all recognized this. 70% of Australians completely recognize that climate change is a problem and we need to do something about it. It's a question about how we're deciding about the actions that we do. And I find great inspiration and hope in the movements and the fact that these movements are building. And then we've got intergenerational equity when we look at movements, because I marched in Glasgow on Saturday and we have children as young as 3 sitting on their parents' shoulders, up to those, who are very elderly and walking with crutches, who was all in this together. And this is why I think it is critical that every one of us who has any ability, any power, any privilege, any authority, you don't need to be a scientist, you don't need to be a lawyer, you don't need to be an academic, to be really able to just start contributing to how we're addressing climate change. And mostly, it is not a question about just depending on governments to fix it and wait for that to happen. I think we can all start leading community-owned, locally led actions. And that's helped a lot in addressing climate change.
There have been 2 other questions that raise the issue: is effective action on climate change to some extent, or to a considerable extent, hamstrung by 2 factors. One, overpopulation. Is that a factor that's dragging, if you like, makes for much slower progress than otherwise might be the case? And if so, what can be done about it? And secondly, is the need for a very substantial part of the international community still living in poverty, who need to be transitioned from poverty to a reasonable degree of economic and social well-being? Is that task also, which is important, not presenting another problem in the path of effective climate change action? So, Robyn or Kavita, or either or both of you, please.
Kavita, you go first, I'll follow.
This conversation about overpopulation as leading to the climate crisis is one that we feminists, especially those that I work with, is fundamentally used as a distraction. The climate crisis is being caused by fossil fuels, full stop. Everything else is part of the process that's contributing, part of those things that are contributing. So whether that's your meat and dairy industry, whether that's our patterns of production and consumption. And with overpopulation, what it does is it's already, like women in the global South, these are communities that are entrenched in cultural systems of patriarchy, discrimination, and violence. We haven't fixed that. And we're now pushing population as another problem on these women. Recognize the systems of injustices of patriarchy that is first inhibiting these women from really uplifting themselves from poverty and cycles of poverty and generational poverty. Women in the global South may walk down to a pharmacy and be able to get contraceptives. Do you think these women even have access to health services anywhere where they live? No. So recognize the vast difference in how we live in the global North and in developed cities to those in the developed South. And once you recognize that, so fundamentally, Joe, your question about lifting people from poverty, education, health. Yes, women from the global South need more fairer access to education. If they're educated, they can make wiser choices, they can be employed, yet that they're being burdened. And this is the same thing about, the conversation about vegetarianism and veganism. Yes, it's a good thing, but can Indigenous people afford to buy macadamia butter? And even the systems that are providing the products now for a vegan diet, it comes from exploitations of avocado, corn, and soy from the global South. These products are all greenwashed. Greta Thunberg is on spot. It's business as usual that's greenwashed. And that's the problem. And I'll leave it at that. And Robyn, I'll leave, to you.
On the overpopulation question, clearly it's fossil fuels is the main problem. There are other greenhouse gases, of course, but it's more to do with overconsumption in the global North than overpopulation in the great. Overpopulation is a relative to what? Carrying capacity according to what economic system? So it keeps just peeling back the onion to other questions that become more important. The best way of dealing with, high fertility rates is education of young girls and access to contraception. And, it's no surprise that one of the lowest fertility rates in the world is in Catholic Italy because they do have that access. But the point about poverty is a really important one. I think what we don't want to think along the lines that, the global North got rich following a certain path. We can't do it. You're trying to kick the ladder down, so we're entitled to go down that path too. That's not helpful for the global South. What we need to think about is leapfrog. Let's leapfrog over the fossil fuel path you took straight into a renewable energy path, which has all sorts of democratic and other advantages in terms of community resilience and participation and so forth. And it's a distributed form of energy, so it's a distributed form of power in the double sense of the term, electricity and political and social power. So I think it's really important that we think of it as a leapfrog. rather than a repetition of a path that was commenced unwittingly, but was discovered to be problematic, but just stayed with it for way too long. So I think there's this idea in economics, it's called the Kuznets curve, that a developing country has to go through a growth process that produces more emissions and more environmental degradations until it reaches a level of wealth where public concern for environment grows and then it starts to turn around. So it's an inverted U. Well, that's problematic. It's like you've got to stuff up the environment before you can save it. It makes no sense to anyone, particularly local people, if it's their local environment. So the leapfrog theory, leaping into a circular economy, local economies, renewable energy economies is the way forward.
Okay, we're getting quite a lot of questions. I've been paraphrasing as many as I could in the ones I've posed, but let me now turn to another bracket of questions, which is in part to do with an assessment of COP26. Has, to your knowledge, COP26 given sufficient or any attention, serious attention, not just in terms of speeches, but agreements, to what is to be done about the most marginalized communities in different parts of the world? That's one question about what COP26 has or has not done. Has COP26 addressed at all the question of whether we should reduce our energy consumption, altering the patterns of everyday life, so that we have less need to use any kind of energy, be it based on fossil fuels or renewables? Is a reduction of energy consumption seriously on the table at COP26? And thirdly, what are we to make of the commitment made by some, but by no means all countries, to stop deforestation by 2030? Is that commitment by some, but not all, a case of too little, too late? There you are, some curly questions for you. Who would like to have a go at one or other of them?
Kavita, I will defer to you on the most marginal communities question, because that is your forte.
Joseph, look, my own view is very little. Like I said, we get very sympathetic understanding from political leaders, and then these same political leaders, then they tell us that they're very strapped as well about how much they can do, and they recognize and they feel sorry. But in terms of genuine action, in terms of strengthening social protections within their countries, the answer is no. The global South countries constantly say we just don't have the capacity and resources because they're stuck in debt to the global North. And so, the global North, again, through the capitalist system, rely on cheap labor and natural resources and extraction from the global South. And that is their form of like, okay, so, we have to deregulate, privatize, weaken labor rights, environment safeguards to allow companies from the global North to come to the global South and, produce clothes, produce shoes, produce food, and so forth. This is the system. This is fundamentally the system. So unless we really tackle debt justice in the global South and really transform what social protection should look like and strengthen that, no, climate crisis is all about human rights. And unless we start addressing and tackling human rights first, we are leapfrogging into a new era that will again only serve the elite. Thank you.
On the energy usage question, it's a great question, and my answer is quite short. Very little attention's given to it. But of course, demand management is the best way of reducing demand, is the best way of reducing emissions. It doesn't cost anything. And the problem with renewable energy, because it's becoming cheaper and faster and more accessible, we're seeing what economists call the Jevons paradox, or the rebound effect. You save money on all the appliances you've bought, so you buy more appliances. And you end up consuming more energy, not less, because it's cheaper. And this is not what we want. The best transport policy in the world is a bicycle for everyone and a fast, efficient train service rather than an electric car. But that's where we're heading. As to the third question about forests, now forest has been a really, really tricky international area. At the Earth Summit, way back in 1992, they tried to get a forests agreement up, but it failed. Most of the agreements that are in place are pretty much looking after the timber industry. And the pledge on deforestation is just that, a voluntary pledge. It's not actually formally part of the negotiations on finalising the Paris rulebook. But COP26, like all COPs, is much more than negotiations. It's a big show and tell regime. It's like an expo, and certainly there's a lot of encouraging voluntary coalitions of the willing, from powering past coal to methane pledges to deforestation. And all of this is good because it's action happening not by full agreement, but by those who are prepared to go there in the hope that build it and others will come.
Right. Well, we're getting very close to the end. There are two questions, and perhaps we'll need to leave it at that, but they're large questions. Pledges are being made, the question is, pledges are being made at COP26, some substantial, some less so. But do we have any faith that those pledges will, even the so-called better ones, will be actually implemented? Whether because of no real interest in honoring those pledges, or simply because of lack of capacity to implement them. Many previous COPs have led to pledges which haven't been effectively fulfilled. Do we have reason to think that this will be any better this time around? That's one question. And the other one is if you like, the problem we face with that civil society faces. With so many of the big media and the social media, the traditional media, the social media, in so many parts of the world, not willing to depart in any substantial way from either the mainstream line of the official line, what hope do we have that civil society can really make its presence felt, its voices heard in a way that will make a difference?
Well, as to the pledges, quick three-prong answer. Many developing countries, with their nationally determined contributions, as they're formally called, made them conditional on adequate support, climate finance. Now, if that's not forthcoming, then these parties are quite understandably not able to reach those pledges. But we also know that there are no compliance mechanisms for failure to reach a pledge in any given commitment period. And that was something that some countries tried to get into the agreement, but certain countries, led by China and India, and not only, but they were big objectors to any kind of punitive sanctions. So what the parties have instead is trying to develop a robust transparency mechanism, and that's why it is a show and tell regime, and it's the glare of publicity that is supposed to do the work. Now, in my experience as an international relations expert, there are some countries who are easily shamed and for whom their reputation matters a great deal. And there are others that can't be shamed. Sweden can be shamed, Norway can be shamed, Russia can't be shamed. It seems Australia at the moment can't be shamed. So it depends on the country, on the countries in question. But because the price of renewables is falling, it is becoming easier to start reducing emissions. So that's one good point. But the Paris Agreement is a very unique experiment in international law writing. And it's got this bottom-up pledge and some more sort of prescriptive language riddled through it. It's a mixture. There is this incorrect argument that the Paris Agreement is not legally binding. That's not true. It's a convention within the meaning of the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, and the principle of you must keep your treaty commitments is a fundamental principle of international law. So it's binding even though there aren't sanctions. So people mistake the lack of sanctions for it not be binding, because you can still have sanctions and it won't force certain countries to do what you want. So they need to commit to the agreement, and international law is based on state consent. So because states all consent to that agreement, you'd expect them to implement it. Not all states do that, but most states comply with most treaties most of the time. And I think you'll find that with the Paris Agreement. It's just that some of those that don't really matter because they're in the G20.
And do you have any thoughts on the whole question of how civil society can make its voices heard in the light of media that may be either hostile or indifferent?
Yes, well, the legacy media, that's traditional news and television, has been co-opted in some countries, particularly in the Anglosphere, where they get quite shrill, like Fox News. Murdoch's supposed to turn itself around now, but all it's doing is supporting net zero. And as Kavita said, that doesn't mean anything for now. Social media is a very mixed blessing. It connects a lot of people, but it's got no rules about civility and no filters, and it can do a lot of damage too. So my answer to the question is, at the end of the day, we use our bodies in the streets, in main squares. That's how it's always done. The more bodies out there, nobody can deny that there's not concern. That's why we've seen bodies in the streets of Glasgow. That's why we've seen marches by children, marches by everyone in Melbourne, Sydney, and other major capitals in Australia, and right around the world. I mean, I'm thinking of Copenhagen in 2009. 350.org, which Bill McKibben's involved in, had global demonstrations around the world, and they were absolutely creative, where 350 was etched in sand, it was up on mountains, it was under the water, and there, in the global north and the global south, it was the most heartwarming display of civil society global solidarity. And we're seeing that here with COP26 as well, out in the cold streets of Glasgow, because it's so hard to get on the inside. But I think that's what's going to save the world.
Well, I think on that upbeat note, it's as good a way to conclude this particular webinar, this event we've been having on COP26. We have a reasonable idea of where it's heading. And clearly, it's not going to solve a lot of the outstanding problems. Perhaps it will produce one or two useful results. We won't know for another day or so. But let me, on behalf of everyone who's been part of this, to thank all three speakers, Kavita Naidu, Tim Flannery, and of course, Robyn Eckersley, who's been with us to the end, the others being in Glasgow and having to make time, given many other commitments still ahead of them, had to leave us a little earlier than now, but we're still very grateful for them. So thank you to all of you who have been participating. Thank you to all those who have helped in so many different ways. And thank you to Ben, who's been the technical mastermind, not seen, but his work greatly valued. To Alex, who helped with the questions, and to Christian, who's helping with summarizing this event for inclusion we plan in the coming Conversation at the Crossroads newsletter. And as you can see on the screen, a very important gathering nationally and internationally that we hope many of you will be able to attend, and between now and then support and be ambassadors for in any way you can. We thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you in person or online in the very near future. Bye to everyone.